The New Guinea Highlands stretch across a rugged landscape, a series of jagged ridges and deep valleys that rise sharply from the lowlands. Morning mist clings to the slopes, drifting in slow currents above rivers and streams that cut through the dense vegetation. The forest is dense, the canopy a layered mosaic of ferns, palms, and towering hardwoods, interspersed with the occasional flowering shrub. Sounds are muted at first light, the distant call of birds, the soft rustle of leaves, and the subtle trickle of water over stones. The terrain alternates between steep inclines and flatter terraces where the earth collects in shallow basins. Trails, often narrow and eroded, wind along the ridges and into hidden valleys. The air is thick with humidity, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil and decaying foliage. Occasionally, shafts of sunlight break through the mist, illuminating patches of moss or the surface of a slow-moving stream. This region is sparsely populated. Villages are few and far between, each accessible by footpaths that climb and twist across the mountains. Outside these settlements, the highlands are largely untouched, presenting a natural isolation that can be both serene and unforgiving. The quiet is unbroken, a measured stillness that frames the landscape before the intrusion of human presence. Here, the environment itself commands attention, setting the stage for any traveler who moves within it. The morning is calm. No wind rattles the trees, no sudden rainfall breaks the silence. The scene is one of patience, observation, and slow discovery. The highlands appear indifferent to human activity, vast and continuous, stretching beyond sight in every direction. The traveler in this story was a young man in his early 20s, originally from a small coastal town far from the highlands. He had grown up near the sea, where the terrain was flat and the climate temperate, but had developed a strong interest in remote exploration. His early experiences included short treks in nearby forests and a few organized expeditions in lowland jungles. He was physically fit, accustomed to long days of walking and carrying supplies, yet had never faced the prolonged isolation of a mountainous region like New Guinea. His preparation for this journey had been modest but deliberate. He carried a backpack with essential items, a small knife, a basic first aid kit, waterproof matches, a compact water container, and minimal rations. Clothing was functional, durable canvas trousers, a light jacket, and sturdy boots suitable for uneven terrain. His intent was not recreational adventure but observation and survival testing, seeking to move through the highlands quietly, noting terrain features, water sources, and natural shelters. The young man arrived in the highlands via a local guide who led him to the edge of a remote valley. From there, he was to continue on his own, following narrow footpaths and tracing riverbanks upstream. The guide had given detailed instructions about local conditions. Sudden storms could develop within minutes, streams could swell rapidly, and trails could vanish under undergrowth. Villages were scattered, contact with other humans would be minimal. It was an environment where both physical endurance and careful attention to surroundings would be essential. In the first days, he moved slowly, acclimating to the humid, high-altitude conditions. The air was thinner than at sea level, and exertion caused heavy breathing even on gentle inclines. He noted the variety of flora, recognizing edible and inedible plants based on previous research. Small animals scurried along the trails, wary of human presence. Streams provided fresh water, but he remained cautious, filtering it through cloth to remove sediment. The highlands were not merely physically challenging, they were psychologically isolating. The dense forest limited visual horizons, and the steep valleys often obscured sound. Even birdsong and insect calls seemed distant, absorbed by the vegetation. Each step forward emphasized the traveler's solitude. Despite prior experience with shorter treks, the expanse of uninhabited land introduced a persistent awareness of vulnerability. Though equipped with basic knowledge and supplies, the young man's understanding of the highlands' true difficulty was limited. The initial calm of the environment gave a false sense of security. Trails were sometimes faint, disappearing under moss or leaf litter, forcing careful navigation. Clouds often descended, reducing visibility. Daylight shifted quickly, and without artificial light, moving after dusk became dangerous. Yet, the young man adapted methodically. He marked trees with small scratches to trace his path, used natural landmarks to orient himself, and conserved energy where possible. Meals were taken sparingly, dried fruit and biscuits, supplemented with foraged roots and berries when their safety could be reasonably assured. Each night, he chose sheltered spots, often near rock outcrops or under large ferns, to rest and protect against the cool highland night. Through these first days, the sense of purpose was steady. Observation and measurement guided his actions, and despite minor discomforts, he maintained a practical optimism. He recorded notes about water sources, animal activity, and vegetation types. In his journal, he described not only the physical environment but the mental demands of prolonged solitude. Even as he moved carefully, a subtle tension lingered, the awareness that a single misstep could compromise both safety and progress. The backstory reveals a young man motivated by exploration and self-reliance, drawn to the isolation of the highlands yet not fully tested by it. His skills were adequate for short excursions but had not yet been proven over weeks of continuous exposure. The geography was formidable, and the climate unpredictable. Within this context, he approached the highlands with measured preparation, unaware that the coming days would push his endurance, resourcefulness, and psychological resilience to their limits. After several days of cautious movement, the young man encountered the first unmistakable sign that his journey into the highlands would demand more than preparation, it would demand endurance beyond expectation. A narrow river, swollen from recent rains, blocked his planned route. Attempts to cross using fallen logs proved impossible, and detours led only to denser undergrowth and steep, rocky slopes. At that moment, retreat was no longer practical, turning back would require retracing nearly 2 days of difficult travel through challenging terrain. The environment shifted abruptly. Clouds thickened and visibility diminished. Light rain began to fall, soaking clothing and soaking the forest floor, which became slippery and treacherous. Footpaths disappeared, replaced by uneven moss-covered rock and tangled roots. The young man realized that the isolation was now absolute, he was entirely dependent on his skills, instincts, and limited supplies. Any miscalculation could result in injury, illness, or prolonged entrapment. This was the critical moment when solitude became isolation. There were no villages within a day's walk, no hunters or guides nearby, no signaling options. Even the rivers that had seemed manageable at the journey's start now transformed into unpredictable obstacles, their currents hidden by rain-swollen waters. The physical challenge was matched by psychological pressure, the awareness that every decision carried weight, and every misstep could prolong exposure to the elements. From this point, the young man adjusted his approach. Movements were more deliberate, each crossing required careful assessment of depth, current, and stability. Shelter selection became paramount. He began to prioritize locations near natural formations, rock overhangs, large ferns, and depressions in the terrain, that could provide protection from sudden storms. Meals were carefully rationed, water sourced only from visibly clean streams, and he maintained a strict mental log of his supplies to avoid miscalculations. The first night after this crossing was particularly challenging. The rain intensified, cold seeped through his wet clothing, and the isolation became tangible in the sound of wind through trees and water rushing in the riverbed. Sleep was light and intermittent, punctuated by the fear of losing his bearings in darkness. He awoke repeatedly, checking landmarks and listening to the forest for orientation cues. This was the point of no return, the young man was committed to navigating the highlands entirely on his own. Any attempt to abandon the journey now would have compounded risk, yet pressing forward required resourcefulness and endurance. His survival depended on the meticulous application of every skill he had: terrain reading, ration management, water purification, and mental discipline. By the end of this phase, the highlands had made themselves unmistakably clear, they would allow no shortcuts. The challenge was no longer optional, survival was a measured, ongoing effort. Each step forward represented both progress and exposure, and the isolation that had seemed theoretical now defined every movement. The young man quickly recognized that survival in the New Guinea Highlands required methodical planning. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, with steep ridges, sudden drop-offs, and thick undergrowth. Rivers and streams, once manageable, now demanded careful evaluation before each crossing. He began structuring his days around a routine that prioritized safety, nourishment, and orientation. Each action was deliberate, every step, every ration, every choice of shelter. Morning light often broke through the dense canopy as mist hovered over mossy rocks and leaf litter. He would start by surveying the surrounding terrain, memorizing landmarks, and selecting a safe route for the day. He learned to identify edible plants and roots, sometimes relying on small, colorful fruits that grew along the forest floor or clinging to trees. Occasionally, he found insects and freshwater crustaceans, which became vital sources of protein. He avoided unknown flora unless certain of its safety, understanding that a single misstep could result in illness far from help. Water collection was methodical. Streams were preferred, but he also learned to gather rainwater from large leaves or natural rock depressions. He filtered water through cloth to remove sediment and avoided standing pools. Maintaining hydration became a daily ritual, and he marked collection points to prevent disorientation. Shelter was central to his survival strategy. He built temporary lean-tos using branches, leaves, and ferns, often against natural formations that shielded him from wind and rain. Rock overhangs became makeshift sleeping areas, but he added layers of foliage for insulation. On nights when temperature dropped, he insulated his sleeping area with moss and dry leaves, curling tightly to conserve heat. Smoke from small fires kept insects at bay, and he learned to maintain embers that could reignite quickly. The young man developed a slow, deliberate rhythm to conserve energy. He walked only when light was sufficient to navigate safely, rested often, and avoided unnecessary exertion. Movement through the highlands was careful, every rock, root, and slope required constant attention. Slips could result in serious injury, so he adjusted his gait to balance stability and progress. Mental discipline was as critical as physical survival. He kept a steady internal log of resources, distances traveled, and weather patterns. This record, though mental rather than written, served as both strategy and reassurance. The solitude could have been overwhelming, but he treated it like a structured task, a series of challenges to overcome rather than an endless void. Each morning became a check-in, what had been accomplished, what needed attention, and how to adapt to unforeseen obstacles. Food procurement evolved over time. He fashioned small tools from branches and rocks, allowing him to dig tubers or crack nuts. Opportunistic catches of fish or small animals supplemented his diet. He learned to balance immediate caloric needs with the necessity of conserving energy, prioritizing high-yield tasks over labor-intensive ones with low return. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as he observed subtle changes in the environment, shifts in animal tracks, new fruiting plants, or water levels after rain. The young man also developed routines for personal hygiene and injury prevention. Cuts and scrapes were cleaned using filtered water and leaves, while areas of persistent wetness were avoided to prevent sores. He recognized that minor injuries could escalate if left unattended, so he treated even small wounds with care. Over weeks, a sense of self-reliance grew. The forest, once alien and intimidating, became familiar in its patterns. He could anticipate river crossings, track subtle topographical changes, and select shelter locations that maximized protection. Still, the environment was never forgiving. Storms, heavy rains, and unpredictable river swells were constant threats. His success lay not in conquering the terrain but in adapting to it. The psychological component of survival became apparent during prolonged rain or long stretches without food. He practiced mental exercises to maintain focus, repeating sequences of landmarks, resources, and routes in his mind. He reminded himself of prior successes, a safe river crossing, a functional shelter, a meal gathered from the forest. These small victories reinforced confidence and stabilized his mental state, preventing despair from taking root. The young man's schedule became cyclical: morning surveys, water and food collection, maintenance of shelter, careful exploration of nearby terrain, and evening consolidation of fire and rest. He monitored weather constantly, learning to predict incoming storms by cloud patterns, wind changes, and animal behavior. He also noted subtle environmental cues for potential hazards, such as unstable slopes or sudden changes in river currents. Time, in this period, was measured not in hours but in tasks. Each day brought incremental progress, a slightly more secure shelter, a new food source identified, a river safely crossed. Survival became a series of repeated, deliberate routines that reinforced skill, endurance, and presence in the environment. By the midpoint of this phase, the young man had established a sustainable rhythm. Though food and water were never abundant, his system ensured he could endure day by day. His ability to predict, adapt, and respond to the highlands' challenges reduced risk and increased efficiency. While the environment demanded constant attention, his structured approach transformed isolation into a manageable, if arduous, reality. Despite progress, there were moments of acute difficulty. Heavy rainstorms flooded temporary shelters, forcing him to relocate midnight. Cold nights sapped energy, and occasional minor injuries slowed travel. Still, he adapted, integrating each setback into a more resilient strategy. Experience became a form of security, and observation became both protection and guidance. By the end of this systematic survival phase, the young man had achieved a remarkable level of adaptation. Each day was predictable in its structure yet unpredictable in its details. Survival required a balance of caution, ingenuity, and persistence. Though hunger and exhaustion were constant companions, he had established routines that allowed him to endure. The forest, once a barrier, now functioned as both a challenge and a guide. As the weeks continued, the cumulative strain of the New Guinea Highlands began to manifest. Days of minimal food intake left the young man physically weakened, and minor injuries from sharp rocks or thorny undergrowth worsened. What had once been manageable, the occasional slip or scrape, now carried real consequence. Fatigue made each step more uncertain, and the once familiar paths now demanded heightened attention to avoid falls. Storms arrived with increasing intensity. Torrential rains swelled streams into dangerous torrents, sweeping away improvised footbridges and washing away collected firewood. Nights grew colder and longer, with persistent dampness soaking his shelter, making rest uncomfortable and energy recovery slow. The simple tasks that had become routine, collecting water, cooking small meals, maintaining shelter, took longer and required more exertion, further depleting his limited reserves. Hunger became a constant presence. Roots and fruits, once adequate, no longer provided sufficient calories. Occasional insects or small animals were scarce or difficult to catch, leading to days of near-empty stomachs. Physical weakness began affecting judgment, missteps on slopes or attempts to cross swollen streams became more dangerous. He learned, often painfully, that overexertion could compromise his safety. Mental strain intensified. Isolation, initially a quiet companion, now pressed heavily. The absence of human contact magnified every discomfort. Simple decisions, choosing shelter location, crossing a stream, selecting edible plants, were now compounded by fatigue and hunger. At times, disorientation crept in, landmarks blurred, and the dense forest seemed endless. Despite careful planning, a sequence of minor setbacks accumulated. A heavy rainfall partially destroyed his primary shelter, forcing relocation in wet, cold conditions. A sprained ankle slowed travel, making food and water collection more difficult. The river he relied upon for water overflowed its banks, contaminating previously safe collection points. Each incident added pressure, creating an unbroken chain of small crises. The environment offered no respite. Nights brought heavy dew and low temperatures, increasing the risk of hypothermia. Streams of rainwater infiltrated newly built shelters, drenching supplies and bedding. Exhaustion combined with wetness intensified physical discomfort. The young man became increasingly aware of his vulnerability. A single mistake could have immediate, serious consequences. In these days of compounded difficulty, every act of survival became deliberate and tense. He moved cautiously over slippery terrain, rationed food with meticulous care, and limited unnecessary movement to conserve energy. Even the simplest tasks, lighting a small fire or preparing a meal, required careful attention. Sleep was often fragmented, as awareness of potential hazards kept him partially alert. Occasionally, he encountered natural dangers beyond his control. Falling branches during storms, sudden river surges, and hidden slopes threatened injury or loss of collected resources. The cumulative effect of these events heightened anxiety, though he suppressed panic to maintain focus. Each moment demanded vigilance, physical coordination, and mental clarity, all under persistent deprivation. Despite these escalating challenges, he persisted. He adapted to worsening conditions, improvising repairs to shelters, altering food collection methods, and seeking safer water sources. Yet, the intensity of his environment was undeniable. Survival no longer felt stable, it was fragile, dependent on careful observation, precise movement, and enduring stamina. By the end of this phase, the young man's body bore the marks of prolonged hardship. Minor injuries, sun and rain exposure, and fatigue were evident. The psychological burden was equally tangible, a constant tension between resilience and vulnerability. Each day became a test of endurance, each action a negotiation with the harsh, unyielding terrain. After several weeks of isolation, the first signs of potential rescue appeared. From a distant ridge, the sound of voices or a small signal fire, perhaps set by other local Highlanders, was faintly audible. Though his body remained fatigued, the possibility of contact injected a cautious sense of purpose into his routine. Every movement, from clearing a path to tending a fire, now carried the possibility of attracting notice. He prepared deliberately. Shelter repairs were made to remain stable for an extended period, ensuring he could be visible but safe. Food and water were carefully managed, leaving no trace that could obscure his presence. His prior exhaustion and minor injuries were mitigated as best he could, balancing energy conservation with the need to signal effectively. Eventually, Highlanders navigating the region discovered him. Their arrival was understated, no dramatic rush, no sudden extraction, simply recognition of a lone, weakened figure in the highland forest. They assessed his condition quietly, offering sustenance and assistance in measured, deliberate actions. The careful calm of this rescue contrasted sharply with the intensity of prior weeks, emphasizing survival as a methodical process rather than a sudden triumph. He was escorted down the terrain gradually. Every step was cautious, as his body remained weakened, and terrain hazards still posed a threat. The Highlanders guided him through familiar trails, helping him cross streams and avoid unstable slopes. His survival, while ending in rescue, was framed as the result of continuous, attentive adaptation rather than luck or heroics. Arrival at a nearby settlement marked the conclusion of isolation. Medical attention was administered quietly, wounds were treated, dehydration addressed, and nutrition gradually restored. His physical recovery was slow but steady, mirroring the disciplined approach he had maintained during weeks alone. There were no celebrations, no dramatized accounts of escape, only calm observation and the slow, methodical restoration of health. The resolution emphasized endurance and the human capacity for careful, sustained survival. Months of self-reliance, adaptation, and constant attention to the environment had preserved life, and the rescue was simply the final step in a sequence of deliberate, measured decisions. The young man's experience remained a testament to the balance between environmental knowledge, careful planning, and mental resilience. The weeks alone in the New Guinea Highlands left a quiet, enduring impression. Beyond the immediate relief of rescue, the experience emphasized the human capacity for measured adaptation under prolonged isolation. Every decision, from locating edible roots to constructing stable shelters, had been shaped by observation, restraint, and attention to the environment. Historical records of similar highland survival incidents underscore that endurance in such regions is rarely the product of heroics, rather, it emerges from consistent, patient application of skills and environmental awareness. The individual's survival reinforced this pattern, demonstrating that mental discipline and careful resource management are as critical as physical capability. As he recovered, the highlands themselves remained unchanged, remote, rugged, and indifferent to human presence. The isolation that had seemed overwhelming in the moment became, retrospectively, a framework for learning, the rhythm of survival, the quiet work of sustaining life, and the subtle signals of opportunity and danger. In the end, the story concludes without dramatization. Rescue provided closure, but the highlands retained their austere, immutable character. The narrative of survival, calm and observational, serves as a record of endurance, patience, and the quiet, uncelebrated power of human adaptability in one of the world's most challenging environments.